So there's a few people who are still waiting to file in, but I did want to start off relatively on time and talk about kind of like just a walkthrough of the setup of, using Ruby on Rails and what the expectation would be for things that you do in the assignments starting today and tomorrow, right? So today and tomorrow we'll be mostly focusing on the models aspect of Ruby on Rails. So we won't be creating web applications until maybe like Friday-ish. But I think that, one of the benefits that I mentioned earlier today was the active record ORM and how it kind of helps you polish up on concepts in databasing and SQL. So I think that's why we spend so much time on it, and that's why it's the first thing that we learn. So on that note, let's start off by just talking about what we need to do to actually get into our Vagrant box, right? So that's our first step. We need to get into our Vagrant box. And right now, currently in my second Vagrant box directory. So right now, I need to say Vagrant up if it's not already up. It already is, so I don't need to say that. So instead, I'm going to just say Vagrant SSH. Now I'm inside of my Vagrant box. So where are all my files from my host computer, this MacBook? Where are they stored on this virtual machine? What directory? /Vagrant, exactly. So if I look, I'll see the exact same directories that I had before. So let's make a new directory. Let's call this the June 2018. Okay. Now, how do I create a new Rails project? Anybody got that far? Yeah. Okay. So Rails new. Let me blow this up so everybody can see. So this Rails new command. Move this up. Push this up. Rails new. So here, Rails is like this this command that we've installed when we installed the gem Rails, right? And you might think, wait a second, when did I install this? Anybody have an idea, a guess as to when we installed this? Because we never had to actually run this command like gem install Rails, right? Where do you think we installed it? Exactly, right? So let me open up a new tab, and I'll show you what Alejandro is referring to. Right here, we have the Vagrant file, and the Vagrant file says, hey, as part of the provisioning script, right here, run this file called bootstrap.sh. And if you look at bootstrap.sh, it's just a bunch of terminal commands. And as part of those terminal commands, we actually gem installed Rails. Okay? So this is a very common practice in the development world. They want everybody to run the exact same commands. So instead of, making a text document and just telling everybody to do the command and just hoping that they do them in the right order, they write a script so that everybody is forced to do them in the right order, right? So it's a nice little resource. Anyways, so that's where we installed Rails. So if I say Rails new, I'll call this the intro app. So basically what this does is it just creates a bunch of files, and it also runs the bundle install command. So bundle install, basically what it does is, let's open this up inside of our text editor again. You had a question?
Yes. I noticed that you're inside second Vagrant box. Oh, okay, so for Ruby section, I use first Vagrant box.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're saying that we must create second Vagrant.
No, not at all. I needed to create the second Vagrant box because I messed up my permissions on the first Vagrant box, and it kind of messed up the whole installation. So I had to create another one, and for me, the best way to differentiate it was to call it second Vagrant box. Yeah. So don't do what I did. Make sure you don't run any of the Vagrant commands with sudo, because that will mess you up. Okay? Anyways, so bundle install basically looks at this file called the gem file and says, look at this gem file install all the all of the gems referred to inside of it. And obviously, we're not going to interact a ton with a lot of these gems, right? They're just kind of in the background helping that Ruby magic work, right? But there are a few things that I did want to point out. For example, SQLite 3 is a gem, right? So we need to install that. Uglifier Sass Rails is not a huge thing. But if you notice, every Rails application has jQuery installed. So that means in any JavaScript file in a Rails application, if you say like console log $, it'll work. So jQuery is just like an integrated part of at least this version of Ruby on Rails. Okay. TurboLinks is something that you might run into later. But right here, you might notice that, hey, look, they've already had gem bcrypt in here. You know, cool. So we're not going to use bcrypt quite yet. We won't get into login and reg. But it's kind of nice that they provide that ability to just like comment and uncomment that line to add bcrypt, right? Cool. Now, you might actually have to edit this file, and we will edit this file if you want to install additional gems, right? This first bundle install, it only looked at the gems from the original version of the gem file. But if we wanted to add more gems, we need to run bundle install again, okay? So enough talking. What I wanted to demonstrate is basically the creation of a simple model and kind of how to make that all work. And I guess while I asked you guys to think about what objects, what class we want to create into a Rails model, I did want to show you how you start a Rails server. So Rails s-b. Oh, I'm in the wrong directory. So you need to go to the project directory, and then you run this command Rails s. And Rails s is just short for Rails server. Okay? So Rails s -b 0000. Oh, thank you. Okay. So this -b 0000, this is just something special that we need to add to the Rails server command because we're inside of a Vagrant box, and it's just kind of necessary. So keep that in mind. The platform will tell you to do -b 0000, but if you go to like Stack Overflow, their environment is not necessarily the same as yours, so they might tell you differently. But if you go to localhost 3000, you'll get this welcome aboard, right? So compare that to Django. Django, in order to even get to this splash page, right, it was like a 4 or 5 minute process. Here, Rails new, your name, go into that directory, Rails s, you're good, right? So it's a lot more streamlined, which I like. Cool. So let's generate our model. So you guys have any ideas for the model that we want to make here? I'm gonna go with pizza then. Reptile. Okay. So the Rails G command is short for generate. So what I'm saying is I want to generate a model, and the first thing you say is you want to give it a name. Now, this is something that I really want to stress is important about using Rails is a big portion of the magic that Rails does is it takes the words that you assign to like models and controllers, and it will pluralize them for you to create tables, right? So for example, if I called the model reptile, Rails will magically turn the table into reptiles, and it'll create all these extra methods based off of that name reptile. So it's very important that you follow the naming convention of Rails when you name your models. This naming convention is capitalized, singular, okay? So always remember that. It could cause some issues later on if you don't. So now that I've said that, what are some things that reptiles have? Some characteristics that we want to keep track of. Scales. I mean, you could like a number of scales. I don't know. So color, I think is a good one. So the way that you declare the name of the columns and their types in Ruby on Rails, let me blow this up so that the model command is like kind of split here. So I said Rails generate model, reptile. Then I have color is of type string. So you pass in these key value pairs, right? And then you say, let's say scales is of type integer. And let's do like one more. Likes?
Legs.
Oh, legs. Yeah. And it's a Boolean. Okay. So when I press enter, what this is going to do is that Rails is going to create the model for me based off of this terminal command. Okay? It's a little different than Django. How did we do it in Django?
Edit your models and then migrate.
Exactly, right? So here we still have to go through the process of migrating, but the way that you generate models is not just by editing a text file. It's by running this very specific terminal command with specific syntax. So at the end of the day, when you get used to it, it'll be super fast. When you guys are learning it, you guys might run into some road bumps because it is very specific about how it wants this to be set up. Okay? So just be aware of that. So like I said, we have to migrate these models. So what I just need to say is rake db : migrate. Okay, so rake is one of the pieces of software that Rails uses. And what I'm just saying is go to the database and migrate based off of what? This migration file. Okay, so while this is migrating, let me take a look at this file and kind of point out some things. So if you look at the Rails file structure, it's pretty similar, I'd say, to Django. You have like an app directory. This is where all of like your little logic lies, is where your models lie. And I would say this is probably the app directory is like your number one, your one-stop shop for editing your application, right? However, there is also another extremely important directory. There's a couple. The first one is config, and the second one is db. And db is the one that I'm going to focus on right now. So if we go to db and then migrate, we'll see the migration file that was created when I said Rails G model. And if you look, it says create table reptiles. And it says, okay, I'm going to create this little block of code. And this is the string. It's called color, integer, scales, Boolean, legs, all this stuff, right? The thing I kind of like about seeing this file is like, I don't know, it kind of shows you what it's doing underneath the scenes, beneath the, all this stuff. Okay? So if you look here, because I ran rake db migrate, it'll create this table called reptiles, right? Let's open this properly. Cool. And basically the schema is just a description of all the tables. So I don't know. Let's say, for example, in this really crazy hypothetical situation, you happen to make a mistake about how you design your models, right? I don't know. You guys are perfect. Don't know. I don't ever make that mistake either. Whatever. Just in case, right? How would I go about that in Django? Just like a question for you guys. Let's say instead of calling it scales, I wanted to call it fails or something.
So if you just want to edit your model, edit the text file, and then make migrations, migrate.
Exactly, right? So here it's a little different. And the best way to explain this is by talking about the way that Rails keeps track of migrations, okay? So here I'm going to run a different command. I'm going to run rake db migrate status, okay? And what that's going to give me, it's going to give me a really nice summary of the current migrations that my application is using, that it detects, and the migrations that it has applied. So here it says status up. So what that means is I cannot, for one, schema.rb, it's not like a model file. If I change this to like you know, not color, right? It's not going to change anything. This is just sugar, right? Instead of editing this file, please use the migrations feature of Active Record to incrementally modify your database and then regenerate the schema definition, right? This doesn't actually contain any meaning. Yeah, you had a question?
What's really the point of schema versus like a migration file?
Well, schema is just there to show you what your database looks like. It's not there to represent your database, right? So let's change that back. And the biggest boo-boo you could make is to delete your migration file, right? Because unlike Django, Rails takes very, very seriously the migration files that it has inside of that directory. So if I delete this file and I try to do anything with RakeDB, or even like something as simple as run like a command in the on the model, it's going to crash. And if I can't get that file back, I am out of luck. Okay? So
Negative of Rails?
I don't think of it as a negative at all. I think that migration should be evidence of very, very, like in my mind, maybe because I learned Rails before I learned Django, but in my mind, migration files should be like the truth of the situation, not the models.py, right? And Django takes it the other way around. They think the file should dictate what the migrations look like, right? But that's just personal preference. So here, what can we do to actually change this? Well, we have a couple of ways. The way that I'd recommend for now is to run the rake db rollback command, okay? Now, watch what happens when I run rollback. So what it says is it dropped the table reptiles. It basically looked at the migration file and said, do the opposite of what this migration file is doing, okay? So that's why it's so important to not delete these migration files, because even to revert a change that a migration creates, Rails needs to see the migration file to know what to undo. Kind of crazy like that. What's up?
What if you have a lot of migrations and you realize there's one like way up? Then you do what would that be? You wouldn't do just rollback, would you? Or like,
So that's a situation where you don't want to roll back,
Yeah.
because when you roll back that far, you delete all the models that were created, aka all the items in the database,
yeah.
right? So we could get into that in a bit, but what you could do is you create a custom migration file, and you very easily can modify, okay? But I can talk about that in a second. So what I've done in the meantime is I ran rakedb's migrate status again, and I got back a different message. It says it's down, right? Which means that the migration has not been applied. So that means when we look at schema.rb, it's empty, okay? So that's our evidence for that thing not existing, okay? So what you could do then is once you roll back the migration, you can either modify this migration file directly. The formatting is a little weird, so I wouldn't try to do this off the bat. And I think at this point, it actually is safe to just delete the migration file, okay? So if you're ever gonna edit or delete a migration file, 100%, like double check and make sure that that migration is not up and that it is down, okay? This is like a mistake that could like force you to redo your entire project, okay? So just be very careful about that. Awesome. So let's say that we wanted to, we're in the same situation that Brandon was talking about, and we migrate, we have a bunch of other, hypothetical migrations, and we don't want to roll back that far back. What can we do? We can say Rails G migration, and let's just call this my migration. Okay? And what it does is just creates a blank migration file. So here, what I could do is I could say, I don't know, let's look at some of the commands that we can do in a migration file. Rails migration. Let's do something like add column. Awesome. Right? So let's say add column. What's a column we want to add to this table? Speed. Okay. That's a Rails 5 feature, so that's fine. Add column speed, and then what type should it be? Integer? Okay. And then should they have a default speed? 0? Yeah. They can't move if you don't give them speed. Sounds good to me. So what I do is, if you look at the status again, we'll have 1 up, 1 down, right? And so I have to say rake db migrate. Let's see what happened here. So when you get a issue like this, I would say try to look through and look for the error message. The call stacks are like really big to like kind of look through, but I think the most relevant part was right here, caused by no method error. And it seems like what I did is, let's see. Default 0 to S. It's an integer though. Let's just remove the default, I guess. I think that's what was causing the issue.
I think it was because the default was default colon instead of colon default, or does that not?
It actually failed again. Let's check it out. La, la, la. Create table. That worked. It failed here. Undefined method 2 symbol for default 0 hash. I got rid of it. So what's the second error? It says, la 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 la. There we go. Wrong number of arguments, given 2, expected 3 to 4. Let's look at the actual documentation. Add column. Rails. So what you're going to tend to do is you're going to look at a lot of these documentation files. So let's say changing tables, changing columns. How about I do add column? So add column. I have to write the table name. Duh. There we go. Nice, it worked. So if we look at our schema.rb, now we have a speed. Okay? So yeah, it's just a little bit of a process that you'll have to get used to. Yeah.
My migration is when you want to add to an existing document like this, existing like reptiles, or
It's just whenever you want to edit your currently existing like model structure,
okay.
just in general. And you don't have to call it my migration. You call it like banana. Okay? Cool. But yeah, that's the general idea. So let's actually get into using the interface. And before we get into using the interface, what I'm going to do for querying the model, I'm going to install a gem. There's a gem called Herb. It's spelled like H-I-R-B, but it's pronounced Herb. And this is a really helpful gem for displaying information. So, and it's also good practice on learning how to bundle install. So we need to write bundle install, if I can type. Okay, it went through. Did Herb go in? Yep, sure did. Okay, so let's say I wanted to go and query my model directly. Like in Django, when we learned Django, we did Python manage.py shell, and that's how we could query the database, right? Here, I actually like Rails' interface better. It's called Rails C, or Rails console. Okay, I'll be using the shorthand. So let's say something like reptile.new. Okay, and basically what that does is it just creates an empty instance of the reptile. And yeah, cool, I mean, like, I get this information. It doesn't look much different than the Django shell. But let's see what happens when I enable Herb. then I get this really awesome interface. Okay, so let's say something like reptile.new, and let's say like color is red. Scales, what was scales? It was a Boolean? Was it? Oh yeah, legs was the integer. I mean, legs was the Boolean. So scales, let's say, I don't even know what we're making, but it has like 500 scales. I don't even know if that's a lot. Legs, is it a snake or not? All right. And then speed, let's say is like 15. Okay. So what I did is I created a new instance of the reptile class, right? You've seen this code before. This is OOP. .new on a class is creating a new instance. So basically I pass it key value pairs like we would in Django, right? Except instead of using equal signs, what do we use? We use colons, okay? The queries look very similar though. I say reptile.new, which means that this thing isn't yet in the database. How do we know that it's not in the database yet? Doesn't have an ID, doesn't have a created out, updated out, okay? So there's two ways that you could create items in your database. The first way is you could say reptile equals reptile.new, and then I'll just copy this, paste it right here, and I could say reptile.save. Then what you'll see is the actual SQL command that Rails ran and some confirmation that it actually successfully got to the database. Okay? So that means if I run a command like reptile.all, then I get all the reptiles in my database, which is just that one. Okay? Another way is you could just directly call the reptile.create. So there is a create method on the class itself. And let's see, color. What should the color be? Let's make a blue snake, like a sea serpent or something. So scales, like that many. Hopefully that's not too many. Let's see, legs, false. Speed. I mean, those things can go pretty fast. I give it like a 25. There we go. All right. So if I say reptile.all. Okay? Yeah.
So when you do the dot create, you don't even have to save it, it automatically saves.
It automatically saves.
It's like a built-in function in like every model.
In every model you make. Exactly. I wanted to show the new syntax because that's what you guys have been doing in OOP, but the create is likely going to be something that you do a little more often. Let's just do one last thing and I'll let you guys go. I want to show you guys how easy it is to do validations in Rails, okay? So here I have actually opened my model file, reptile.rb. And here you might notice there's not a lot of information about the table. This is where you store additional things like validations. So let's say I want to say something like validates. What do we want to validate? Let's validate that they all have a color that is present. Okay? So I'm going to say validates color, presence, true. Okay? I might have butchered the syntax on this, so let's just double check. Oh, I don't think I butchered it. Cool.
So it would be false. It would be false if there just wasn't a color in that column.
Yeah, basically what I'm saying is that
It has any color at all.
there has to be something in that column when I try to create it. Okay? So let's try to mess with that. But one thing that you need to know is that in order to make your current console, right? I haven't closed this console yet. However, I still made a change to this model file. So how do I make that change happen in my console? How do I let my Rails console know of that? I just run a reload with an exclamation point at the end. Okay? And what that does is it reloads your model files. Cool. So now that we've done that, let's try to say something like reptile equals reptile.new. And let's just enter in absolutely nothing, okay? Which means that we should fail validation, right? So what'll happen is if I say reptile.save, it says begin transaction, and before it even runs the SQL query, it says rollback transaction. And rollback means that it didn't go through. Now, remember in Django how tough it was to get validation errors and like those messages out? That is created for you here, right? Magic.
It was like 20 lines.
Right?
No, you didn't create that message, did you? Like,
No.
computer just created it.
When I say validates presence true, it knows to say get the name of the column, turn it back singular, add can't be blank. If I add more validations, those things will all stack up on top of each other.
Can you edit the error messages?
You certainly can. You can just, I forget the syntax for it, but you add it on like right here. But in general, I mean, the defaults are pretty good in general, but if you do want to add that custom stuff, there is definitely a way to. So what you're noticing here, though, is that I had to do it with reptile.new, right? I had to save it in a variable. So if I saved it, let's try to do something like reptile equals reptile.create with nothing inside of it. So it'll still roll back, and then I could still say reptile.errors.full messages. Same thing. Okay? So it'll work with the create and the new. Just remember that the error messages won't show up if you do it with a new until you try to save. Okay? If you want to even just check the validity without even like running a query, so if I said something like this, reptile equals reptile.new, and then I just ran reptile.valid with a question mark, then what will happen is I get the errors again, right? But if I just write this, and then I try to grab just the errors full messages, it's not going to show up. You need to force Rails to acknowledge that this is invalid with either the valid question mark or the .save. Both of those would work. Okay? Now if you look at the full messages, it's there. Convenient though, right? Awesome. I want to leave it at that. That's just kind of the very, very formal basics. I know that not a ton of you guys are quite at the level where with regards to like the material, to talk about the more advanced stuff, and that's fine. There's a ton of stuff to go over. But I wanted to kind of give you guys a little bit of a head start with understanding, Rails models. Okay? Sound good? Any questions about this? All right. So that's it for part 1.